Thank you, Sofia. So yeah, my name's Phil Hesketh. I'm the founder of ConsentKit. I'm also on reops Slack as well, if anyone's on there. I'm just at Phil and at ConsentKit on Twitter as well, if anyone has any questions or wants to chat on there. So yeah, how did I get into this then? So I started off I did a master's in 2017 at a place called Hyper Island, and I started to really think about ethics in design, and really the question that drove me was like, are we treating people as means to our ends, or are we treating people as like ends in their own right? And like how I was looking at the way that design was going and the way that it was becoming more and more involved in like shaping wider aspects of society, and it just kind of I just felt like there wasn't really, I personally didn't have any kind of like ethical training or background in ethics at all, and I was wondering like how we would the education that we were getting was like, or the things that we were finding out and learning weren't really preparing us to do this kind of work. So I started to become really interested in like frameworks and tools and what ethics in a wider sense, and started to pull together some things that I'd found from other people that I thought were cool or interesting, or things that we'd used, and some tools that we developed ourselves, and that became EthicsKit, which is kind of a side project that we have. And then at the time, no one was really like, well, a lot of people were taking it seriously, and like, but it wasn't really like a thing. And then around sort of like March 2018, the Facebook sort of scandal and Cambridge Analytica scandal like became big news, and people started to pay a bit more attention to like this sort of reality that what we were doing was the impact really of the work that we were doing, and the impact of technology on society, and like how these things could kind of could shape things, for the worse, and not just for the better. And then a little bit later on that year, the GDPR came out. So after that, I became really interested in data and security, and like how we handle this stuff, and privacy in particular. And also always really felt that informed consent was like this mechanism almost of like, this is the thing that we can give to a person that is really their like guarantee, or their, this is like our promise to them, like say, I'm going to look after your information and we're going to take care of you, and also here's what we're doing and why we're doing it. And it felt like a really big opportunity to really start to build trust with people. And everywhere that I went and started to look, you started to see like it always felt like it was an afterthought, and people never really did it. So I became really interested in consent and started understanding this problem of like, well, how do we do this? And like, why is this so difficult to do? Like, why is it so complicated? And like, how can we make that better? So we started building prototypes, and approached it like you would with any design project. And then later that turned into ConsentKit, which is the company we're running today. And it's really about like, how do we kind of like take a lot of this complexity out and like make it really straightforward and easy for people to do, so that they'll actually do it, but at the same time making it easier for participants, like improving the experience for them, and also making it easier for them to sort of exercise their rights if they wanted to, and have more sort of control over what we're doing with their information. So jump onto the next slide. So yeah, so why is it like so important right now, and like why is it good to kind of talk about this stuff? So privacy is sort of trending upwards at the moment, and it's along with ethics, it's great to see that more and more people are taking this seriously. Like Apple, for example, probably the most famous company, have started to make a really big thing out of it. A lot of CEOs are saying this is one of their top priorities for this year. And one of the reasons why this is that a lot of these regulations and laws like the GDPR or CCPA, are really in effect now, and this is starting. People are also becoming more conscious of what's going on with their data, so they're making more requests, and it's costing organizations more and more to deal with this. And that number of requests that's happening is increasing, like, year on year. So the reason why people are making those requests is, as the wider societal level, like trust in organizations, certainly in the Western world, is starting to really collapse. Or the collapse might be a bit dramatic, but it's really like falling down from what it used to be. And trust in tech giants in particular as well. It's not just governments, it's people are starting to ask questions about what's happening with their data and what's going on. So people are kind of becoming more and more aware of it. So in our context as researchers and designers, what we're being asked to do now is different to what it was before. We're not just designing websites or screens, exclusively. Design's also, moving up into the C-suite. We're working on strategies. We're shaping like wider outcomes. We're finding like value propositions and things like this, and changing. What we're doing is really changing, and the processes and the way that we're designing are becoming less transactional and more about relationships really, and like over a longer period of time as well. And when you think about that from a consent perspective, a consent is really like a transaction almost. You know, it's like, hey, we're going to do this one thing with you. You know, here's why, and are you happy for us to do that? And if you still had that data and wanted to do something else with it, like legally, you need to re-obtain consent. So, you know, we don't really have the mechanism to manage that relationship and manage the people's permissions over that period of time. Finally, you know, one that, you know, I've certainly felt, and I'd imagine other people have too, is that, you know, design is still trying to, you know, even though I think it's really established itself, but in a lot of organizations, it's really trying to still prove a point or whatever. So we need to like demonstrate this value and like demonstrate the value of research and demonstrate the value of design so that we can get sign off to do a lot of this stuff. And we need to do that faster and faster and faster. And it's just making it really difficult for us to kind of like embed best practice and set these things up. And it's why things like researchops have become a thing, because because these things aren't easy to do and they need that time. And when we do them right, obviously the reason for that is the psychological safety of the people who we're learning from. Is like super important. Obviously, we want to take care of people because we're not bad people, but also really for them, it's like a lot of the things that we're talking to them about, they might not know, they may not know what usability testing is, for example, and that might make them feel really anxious. And especially in the light of what's happening globally at the moment with COVID and with politics and everything else, it's like there's people have got a lot on their plates, and it's like, how can we kind of relax and reassure them and make them feel as comfortable as possible? It's really, really, really important. And finally, there's like it's a universal human right, really. It's literally written in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights that that privacy is a thing, and it's something we need to take care of. And I think that a lot of the narrative from big tech and certain parts of the world is around we need to redefine or reimagine privacy, or there's this kind of like counterbalance at the moment. And we forget, I think, that these things it's literally as simple as that. Like it's a human right. So it's also because it's quite a gnarly thing, and there's lots of different angles to it. It's really difficult to sort of talk about this stuff in any kind of context. So one of the things Sophia's very kindly done for us is giving us a scenario, and then what I thought we could do is to make this a bit more like a workshop and less just talking about laws and things. Just say like, okay, this is how we're going to approach it, and like here's something that maybe you could recreate or reproduce for yourselves. So let's take a look at the scenario. So NASA is planning to build an interactive tool that will help aspiring astronauts understand long-duration flight astronaut physical test requirements. So the tools need to be able to gather medical information from aspiring astronauts alongside personal information related to their education and general background. And then this team of UX researchers is planning to interview 20 aspiring astronauts from Europe and the USA. Okay, so the big questions, like what should we consider for our research when it comes to data management, privacy and consent? And also, I'm a big fan of this, is like, how can we set this up right the first time as more of a strategic approach to it, rather than being something that we would do for every project, because we probably wouldn't have time to do that. It's not really realistic or sustainable. So how can we like set up a process or a way to do this so we don't have to do it every time? So let's talk about that first. Get into a reusable workflow. So one of the concepts to understand. Excuse me. So one of the concepts to understand, which comes up a lot in GDPR, is this idea of like controllers and processes. So I'll talk about this for a minute before we get into anything else. So a data controller is basically the entity. So it's usually like the organization who determines like the why and the how for processing data, and then the processors is the entity that actually performs that processing. And a sub-processor could be like a third level that maybe works for or with the processor in order to process that data. So that's a bit abstract and it's kind of a little weird. So let's look at that in some kind of example. So imagine you were a consultant and you were doing some research for a customer or a client. So the client would be the organization, because they ultimately determine the right to process that information. You would be a processor for the client, so they're the controller. And then finally, if you were going to use maybe some like software or if you were going to use like a recruitment agency, for example, to find some people to help you with the research, that recruitment agency would be a sub-processor for you. So in terms of all the data that you gather and the things that you find out, really it's the organization is the person who is kind of in control of this data. So at the end of your project, you need to be able to hand off that work to them. That might involve the data and the findings in a presentation or something that you do, but it should also include the consent and things like that. And if you're in a situation where you're not, the organization doesn't have that consent, it really introduces quite a big risk for them, because if anyone comes back on that study or comes, wants to do a request or anything like that, then that organization is really liable for that information. So that kind of handover, then it's something we might not think about all the time, but it becomes really, 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 really important in this sense. So another one is maybe you're using like some like rapid feedback tools or like some usability testing software, for example. So as an organization, you might use this tool to do it as part of your research, and you need to be able to demonstrate consent from that. So if you can't get consent from the people that take part in that research, then it's like, okay, well, who's the controller and who owns this data? Like, do you own that data, or is that part of the does that tool own that data and that information? So that's kind of hopefully an okay explanation of this, but it's kind of an interesting concept to think about when we think about the relationships between the tools and the people and the things that we're working with and doing, and who's actually responsible for that stuff. So let's go back to the scenario. So the first things I'm going to look at when I'm looking at this is the aspiring astronauts kind of jumps out at me straight away. I'm wondering, how old are these people, and like, are they going to be between the ages of like 16 or or under, or are they going to be over than that, because that's going to affect us in one way or what affects how we approach this from a privacy perspective. And then also, do other regulations apply? So it says here medical information. So I know in the USA there's some laws around that, HIPAA I think it is, and also personal information about their education and general background as well. So there may be it's going to definitely be like personally identifiable information in there, maybe some others. And then we're going to do an interview, so that might be the method, but there might also be some usability testing, for example, involved in that as well. But for this case, let's stay with an interview. And also it's the Europe and the USA. So this is kind of really the big one, because it's like, okay, well, these are the laws that are going to apply to us. So let's kind of work through this. So the first questions we want to really ask ourselves is, which of these regulations actually like apply to us then? So we know that is Europe and the USA. So Europe's kind of straightforward, is if you're doing any research with anyone in Europe, or anyone basically anyone that lives in Europe, or you're collecting data from them in any way, shape or form, whether it's for a product or whatever, the GDPR is going to apply to you. So that's kind of most people, like it's quite a lot of people in Europe. So like a lot of the time that will just apply, and it's just a blanket cover to everything. So in the USA, so the CCPA is the kind of one that's in effect at the moment. But there's also like a lot of other states are starting to follow suit now. So like New York, Maryland, Massachusetts, North Dakota and Hawaii are all starting to follow with their privacy laws, and they're in process right now. So it's already kind of defined what they are. I think they're just going through the process of being put into law, and more of the states are following suit as well. So this is going to be a thing that is going to be, I think it's going to be a bit more complicated in the US because of there's like subtle variations. A lot of these are like, there are similarities between GDPR and the ones that are being proposed in the US, but there are some differences as well. So the main one being so CCPA, for example, doesn't apply to your organization if your annual turnover is less than $25 million a year, or if you like buy, sell or share records, like more than 50,000 records, I think it is, every year. And also if it's like the 50% of your annual revenue comes from selling customer information, then that law definitely does apply to you. Or if it's looking like you're going to be moving to that way, then you need to get rid of it. But if those things aren't true, then the CCPA doesn't apply to you. So that's one thing. So yeah, we also mentioned like some health data and the types of data that we were going to collect. So like HIPAA doesn't actually apply to us in this, because there are different types of you have to be certain types of entities and certain types of transactions which HIPAA covers, And in the case of the medical research that we're doing here, it's not actually linked to a transaction, so HIPAA doesn't apply. And we're also not the same type of entity that HIPAA would apply to. And COPPA is a law around children and like doing and collecting children's data. And if the people we're dealing with, for the purposes of this, like we'll just say the people we're dealing with are over the age of 16, so that doesn't apply. But the special category data is a subset of data from the GDPR. We'll go into that in a bit more detail later on, like specifically what that is. But that is going to apply to us. So I've just kind of picked these out. There are like hundreds of global PII laws to choose from. There's a phenomenal tool on the researchops community have got, and I think it was developed with the American government Department of Health and Human Services. But it's the global PII laws on the researchops community, and it's essentially like an Airtable full of all of the laws. So you can just search by country to see where you are, and it pulls up any relevant stuff and what types of things it covers, like whether it's medical data or anything. It's pretty incredible as a resource. So check that out if you're doing some research, and that will give you like a good starting point or base to see what is and isn't going to be applicable to you. So, okay, so that's like loads of laws and like words, but what does that actually mean? Like, what does that kind of translate to us? So, if we take if we look at GDPR and we look at CCPA and we just kind of like blanket that and put it into the context of user research, this is what I think it means for us. So I'll break this down into like user needs. So participants, basically, we have this, one of the things is the right to be informed. So obviously informed consent is probably going to be the vehicle that you use to do this. But the real needs of this are like participants need to understand what categories of information you're going to capture and like what, and then they also need to understand like what is it that you're going to do with that information that you're going to give us. Are there any like consequences, anything like that? And then also like what are their rights? Like what are they entitled to? And they need to kind of know this because I guess in their head it's like, well, I want to make a reasonable decision about whether or not I want to take part in this research. And that's really the informed part of informed consent. So the consent is just I can take part, but the informed bit is like I have enough information to figure out if I actually want to take part or if this is going to affect me adversely in any kind of way. So we'll go into a little bit more of that later on in the participant experience, but that's kind of the crux of that. So the second thing is the right to access. So this basically means that like people have people need to be able to access any information that they have and like see a copy of that information that you have on them. And it's really just their personal data, right? So it's like any point they can make a request to do this, and we need to be able to get that to them within a reasonable amount of time. I think usually it's like 30 to 45 days, but that actually puts some challenges on us operationally. So if we're running a research department from a research ops perspective, it's like, well, how do we actually know? So when this person comes in, the first thing I need to do is verify this person and see if they've actually taken part in research or not. And then usually they will say, so there's some guidelines at the bottom here about like an actual process to handling a subject access request, which might be useful. But they'll basically say, yeah, this person has been involved in some research. They want to see information about that research. We need to then go back and say, okay, let's find out any recordings, any snippets, everything that we have that's linked to that person. And be able to pull that together into some kind of report and then share that with the person to say, this is the information that we have on you. And you have to be able to do that within 30 to 45 days. So this is the thing from the beginning where I said we were getting more and more and more requests. Like this is starting to happen more frequently. And usually what follows someone's asking for their information is they usually ask for it to be deleted. It's kind of a typical follow-up. So we need to be able to delete that. And that sounds quite straightforward, but sometimes it's not. We'll talk a little bit about workflows in a sec, but when you start to think about the different tools that we're using, to process this information, whether we're anonymizing it, calendars, email, all of these different things, we start to really leave these huge trails of information across. So to actually go through and delete everyone's information from the system takes a bit of thought and takes a bit of planning. But yeah, so that's something else to kind of think about. There's not only a need that we need to enable for participants, but it's also like from the reops perspective, it's like, well, we need to have something in place that allows us to do that. So then finally there's this like right to withdraw or just basically to opt out. So in the CCPA is a little different to the GDPR in this one. But basically, like if someone has given you their permission to take part, they should also be able to say, they should realize that that's voluntary, and then they're not bound to anything, even if you've given them an incentive or something like this. If they want to come, if they want to be taken out, they should be able to. I think in the CCPA is more about opting out from selling your data, which is a slightly different thing. So I mean, I can't think of a situation where researchers would sell data, but yeah, who knows. But yeah, so this is also quite challenging for us. And if you think about it, as a research goes on and as a project goes on, it's like, how do you start to unpick that data from that process? It could just be deleting the raw data, but you might have like snippets and things, and if those haven't been anonymized, then that could go deeper and deeper into a project. So it becomes quite tricky to do. But yes, we're thinking about that and how you would do that if that came about. So hopefully that's given you some kind of like a practical take on like what that means for us. So the next thing to think about really is like what type of data that we're collecting. And rather than kind of like going into that so if we're interviewing people, let's say for this research for NASA, we might be talking to them about like their life events. We might, that might be over a Zoom call at the moment because nothing's happening like face to face, obviously. So, we might record like videos of them. So we might capture their images. We're going to capture their voice, like all these different things. So this is all this is like personally identifiable information. But a lot of the time it's like, well, what is and what isn't that? What isn't PII or personally identifiable information? So I wanted to define what that is a little bit first, and then go into that in a bit more. So it's basically PII only applies to any living person or living individual, and it's because if they can be identified either from that data directly. So like a picture of my face or my voice, for example, is like a direct identifier, or it could also be from other data which is in possession. And this is a little bit harder to figure out because, say for example, if I gave you my postcode or my zip code, and then you had some other information about me, like my gender and maybe my like ethnicity or maybe my like profession, you could start to narrow that data set down from like say 200 people to 100 to 50 to 10 to 5, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, actually this could be one of 5 people. So you can actually start to identify people through things that may not at first appear to be something that you would be able to identify someone from. So there's 2 types of PII. There's like these direct identifiers. So this is things like this, like, first names, identification numbers, biometric data, like voice signatures is a big one that some people don't realize, photographs and stuff like that, IP addresses as well. But then also like some indirect identifiers, things like date of birth, where you were born, telephone numbers, employment information, stuff like that. So there's different kind of types. This list is taken from one from Pittsburgh University. They've got a really great resource around that and like different types of PII. And special category data, which we mentioned earlier on. So this is under the GDPR, and this is really any data that's like reveals any type of like racial or ethnic origins, like political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, and so on and so on. Like it's really difficult to. It's depending on the type of research that you're doing, but if you're interviewing someone and you're getting really into stuff, like it's difficult for this stuff not to come out sometimes. So like most of the time you're probably going to be capturing some kind of like special category data. But it's also like we're thinking, when you're doing this, when you're going through and doing your research, it's like, well, what is the data that we're capturing, and like what do we really need that data for? If you had to jump through lots of more hoops, which you do, with the GDPR to capture this data, it's like we start to ask questions about, well, should we actually get it? So, for me, it's like if you're not going to learn something from having this, or if you can't use that to tell a story about what's happening, then don't record it. Sometimes it's difficult to just not record it, but like you can manage that slightly differently afterwards. But also it kind of gets you into some really interesting places where it's like, well, how could we tell a story like without personally identifiable information? One of the big real impacts of user research is that you can tell these really powerful, really human stories, which have impacts and people listen to, and they stick with people, they remember them. They can be quite influential in terms of what we're trying to do and change. So there's a guy called Omar Redder, and he's got linked to his article down here, but he tells stories with people's hands, and I think this is like really, really interesting. And it's like, you could tell stories about this, and you can start to see like how someone has lived, and like, get an idea for like who they are from their hands. Like this picture I think is amazing. It's about like, you can start to sort of imagine like the type of life that someone's had or whatever, and you can see how this could supplement something which would, which can be really, really powerful. But so there's some quite creative ways that we can do this, and I think that's it's quite fun to sort of explore that and play with it a little bit. So yeah, so this is kind of then, I guess, like looking at what our current workflows look like would be the next one. So this is something that we've actually built a workshop out to help people with this. So one of the things we found is that this is like, nobody really likes being told what to do, and nobody really likes like a process being kind of imposed on them. So we built this workshop to run with teams and research departments, so that it's kind of like a reflexive exercise to get people to map out like, okay, what's our workflow right now? Like, what are we, where do we get data from? Like, what kind of tools are we using as this goes through? What type of data are we collecting along the way? Like, how do we transfer that data from one place to another place? And to start to have these conversations really and understand. And then through this like process of like mapping and reflection, a lot of people kind of come to conclusions where they're saying like, oh, I didn't realize, I'd not even thought about this, or I've never really kind of like mapped this out before, because we're all going in like 100 miles an hour or whatever. So it's quite good to align like a wider team, but also from a if you're handling special category data and you need to produce a data impact, data protection impact assessment for GDPR purposes, we need to map data flows anyway and understand like how these things are captured and moved through. And a lot of the time now, a lot of software is either in the cloud, so you're going to be leaving traces of it there, or it's it might back up to the cloud. So for example, if you use like I use like Adobe tools, and they have this these functions to back up to the clouds and stuff. So if I need to clean my data down after I've done some research, I need to go back to those places and make that part of my process, or just make sure that I don't back it up there in the first place is usually a better way. So yeah, kind of like it's a way. You can get a link to the workshop here if you want to go and check this out yourself. There's like instructions on how to run it. It's something that we run with people as well. But really, it's like quite a good exercise to figure out like how this is sort of working for the types of methods that you're doing, and figure out the kind of a bunch of questions that you kind of need to write really, really solid informed consent forms. So this one was just like an example one for an interview. So yeah, so like one of the reasons why we do that is like, we start asking like, when we start looking at, like at how we, what are we actually doing with this data that we're collecting, and like how are we kind of like processing it. One of the things, that you need to sort of specify in your informed consent is like, well, how long are you actually going to keep this data for? And other times like we might apply like just like a random number to this, but I think it's worth giving it a bit of thought and really just thinking about this. Like, because the more we carry, for as long as we're carrying this information, we're also carrying this responsibility. And it's like how, one good way to mitigate that is to just kind of clean up after yourself, like at certain points. So, the research admin might take a week, for example, then we might spend a week doing interviews, then we might spend 2 weeks synthesizing those interviews, and then we might spend like, 8 weeks storytelling and using that throughout the organization, to kind of like talk about the project. So this whole thing could only be like, say, 3 months. And after the 3 months, we don't actually need that data anymore. We don't need to keep it. So if that's the case, then you can delete it. But that's not always the case. And I think it depends on the type of research that you're doing. I had an amazing conversation with Bridget Meltzer from the reops community, and she's written this brilliant article about pace layers and the usefulness of research. And one of the things that she's saying is that, like, if you're doing more like evaluative research and you're kind of in this level of, maybe like usability testing or something like this, as soon as you've learned that thing, you figured out what the problem is with the way that it currently works, you can change that thing quite quickly, and then you're kind of onto the next one. So you might want to see it again. So as soon as that interface has changed, the actual research you had on that point, like some of the learnings might be key, but you might not necessarily need to hold all of that data. So in that sense, you probably could wipe that down after, say, 90 days or 6 months or however long. Whereas if you were doing like deeper interviews about people's like cultural beliefs and things like this, which change much slower than the higher ups things on these pace layers, these are like deeper, longer term studies. Like actually the data in that and what you find and learn from that it could be really useful for like a much longer period of time. So, and that's something that if you're going to hold it for that long, it's something we need to communicate with participants so they understand. But also I think in those cases, this is when managing that consent around a relationship becomes even more important, because really it's about if you wanted to use that data set, it's a big problem in academia actually, is they have these like huge data sets that they build up, but then they're not actually allowed to reuse them for something else without going back and getting permission for those, because they don't have consent to use it for that new study. So it's kind of an ability to do that and to be able to say, okay, well actually those interviews are super useful and they will probably still be useful in say 3 years or 5 years. Should we keep them for that long? And if so, then tell that to that person and say we'll be back in touch with you or whatever if we're going to reuse them again. So some of the different there's anonymize. People say like they're going to anonymize data a lot, and myself included. And like anonymization is actually really difficult to do. And what happens a lot of the time is something called like de-identification. This is like another way of handling data, and it's just really like stripping out those direct identifiers that we talked about earlier in the PII. And really like making it so like this might be a blur a face or something like this, but the voice is still there, or obscure the voice, for example. But this isn't always like key anonymization. Anonymization is like a super complicated subject, so I don't want to. I'm really like skimming over the top of it here. But there's this resource at the bottom, which is fantastic about like anonymization decision making frameworks about how to do stuff and how to like test it. Like true anonymization is really like it's just ensuring that the risk of somebody being identified is negligible. And this is also when you start to combine different data sets together, like I was telling you before. Like this is really something that is like difficult to do. So there's a thing called the motivated intruder test, which is like a really interesting way to be like, okay, like this is how we can test like the levels of anonymization. But this is something that's isn't easy to do. So I'd kind of be aware of this as well when you're telling this to people and saying like, what is it you're actually like doing with that, and now you're actually anonymizing that data. And also like there's kind of a bigger question. So I was talking to someone about anonymization a while ago, and I didn't actually know about this person, but there was a lady called Henrietta Lacks, and she unfortunately died of cancer in like 1951, and her cells, her cancer cells were taken and then formed this thing called the HeLa cell line, which went on to become like one of the most important cell lines in medical research. And like the reuse of this was phenomenal, but she had no idea that they were going to do that, and her family had no idea that they were going to do that either. And this cell line became like so significant to everything beyond cancer, into like research into AIDS and into like lots and lots of other things. And it's like one of the most like significant contributions to medical research I think any individual has ever made. And it got to the point where it was so like crazy that in like the 70s, people found out that it was her and realized it was her line and started to contact her family, and her family were having all these requests. And the family had no idea why, like they didn't know what was going on, and they'd not really spoken about it. And then in 75, they found out like what had actually happened. I mean, it's just like, it's kind of a crazy story, but it's like, on one hand, there's like, well, the family should really know. And, if people are going to ask the family about their, genetic, their genetics and things like that, then it's really like, why are you coming to me about this? And what's this, I can imagine that being a really like confusing situation and difficult situation. But also, the other side of it is that, it's like, do they have a right to do that? Like, this is essentially this family's like genetics, and it's like, these people are being used, and they're being used so like broadly. It's kind of, it's like they should have some kind of like say in that, I suppose. And also, like, finally, I guess the last one is that the contribution that this person made was never really like, acknowledged until recently, like, and now it's starting to be more and more acknowledged. But sometimes we might be doing research into something amazing, that could have a huge like social benefit, and it's like the people that are taking part in that research, if we just anonymize their data straight away, it's like, well, do they actually want to be acknowledged for that contribution? Right? So maybe it's something else to think about or to talk to them about. So let's talk about the participant experience. So kind of we've got that's kind of like the things to think about, I guess, from a REOPS perspective. But really, like, at the end of the day, like we're talking about making people feel safe and their psychological safety. It's like, well, it's really important to do this, not just because they're going to show up and, they're going to, they'll be more likely to sort of like share their stories, but it's really like that they trust you with that information, and that, and ultimately they just feel like relaxed and like less anxious about taking part. I've had people turn up to sessions with me, and years ago when I was doing usability testing, and it was clear that they just didn't know what usability testing was. And it was like a lot of the language that we were using became like really kind of just design heavy language, and it was like they're not really sure what these things are, or maybe they just turn up for the incentive and they're kind of nervous about it, or maybe they think that you're testing them and not just testing a thing. So there's like ways that you can dispel all these things really, really easily in your informed consent process. But essentially it's just put yourself in their shoes and like think about the language that they use, and try to be aware of like what we're doing, and like aware of the language that we're using, and like how can we kind of bridge that gap really to sort of build that relationship. Part of that is just communicating really clearly and just setting expectations of people. So we're not trying to, like I say, in the usability test example, like we're not testing them, we're testing, we're testing a thing, and this is why, and their perspective is what's more important to us. It's not about getting the thing right or wrong or being able to pass. We just want to know how they think and feel about things. And sometimes when you just kind of point that out to people, it just takes the pressure off them a little bit and makes them feel better about it. So one kind of like process I use for this is, kind of breaking up our responsibilities to people start from the second, we recruit them and we do screening, because that's when we're starting to collect this information. And from that point, and, I found that one of the things with informed consent is that you want to try to give it to them as early as possible, or at least ahead of time, so they've got some time to think about it, some time to, maybe ask people questions or ask you questions. And there's less kind of coercion and pressure on them, to do that, and try to do that before they've committed too much to anything else as well. Like if you ask consent from someone after they've taken like a 1 hour bus ride to come there and spent money on it and taken the morning off work or done whatever, it's like by that point they're kind of already in, like it's going to be harder for them to say no than it will be to say yes. So it's like, how do you just do that as early as possible? And just, kind of invite questions really, and have this discourse with them, make sure that they understand things, make sure that they, if they have any questions, they feel weird about anything, just to talk to you about it, kind of really open your door to them. And then usually I'll send them like a bit of a reminder, like maybe the day before the session, just to see if we're still on, and just remind them the date and the location and stuff like that. And again, further invite questions. And then obviously you do all the typical stuff on the day, which most researchers are great with. And we've got like after the session, it's like it doesn't really stop at the session. It's like afterwards we need to remember to to delete their information. We might anonymize their information. All these other things that we do in synthesis, and like how we continue to sort of like respect people after they've given us that information is really, really important. And then finally, the last one is like, just don't make life difficult for people to help you. I just see this like so often, and it's something that every time someone gives me like a contract, like, I mean, maybe they'll give me like a PDF to sign or something like this, or a document or whatever, and they send it to you. They can you just sign this and return it, and then I've got to find a printer somewhere and print it off, and I might not have one, and now I can't leave the house because we're in a lockdown or whatever. And like all these like things just make it more and more stressful and more difficult. It's like, how can you just kind of remove this friction from people so that they, they're not having to kind of jump through these hoops and do these things just to take part in research and help you really. Another big part of this as well that's quite often overlooked is like accessibility of the tools that we're using. Like, are people able to access it if they're visually impaired, or if they have any other kind of accessibility needs? Is the consent form that we're sending them accessible? Is a written document like the best thing to send them? There could be like other ways. Like, are they able to understand that? Like, is it written in a language that they understand? Things like this, or that it written in their native language, or that they're comfortable with. And yeah, so basically, like, this is another thing that I think gets overlooked quite a bit, but it's worth really just checking to see where are the tools that we're using accessible and good and fit for purpose. Yep, and that's me. Thank you for listening.
That was wonderful. So good and so intense. I have to look at the deck and the video again. It's a lot of information, but it's really useful. We have some very, very nice questions here that we can go through. But I wanted to share something. It's like a pre-announcement. We are building an integration with ConsentKit. And so what we want to do is we're going to facilitate, well, they make everybody's life super easy, because all this processing, all this information, all these things that you need to do to keep compliant and just treat your participants the right way, they made it super easy. And then we're going to be able to sync that information in terms of who gave you consent, who didn't, what information you have, whether you have to delete the data. All these different processes will be, or data points will be synced into EnjoyHQ. So all the participants and all the information about customers that you have are up to date with the status of what was the consent from the participant. And there will be other cool things that we're building. So if you want to be part of like that beta program, let us know, come to us or go to Phil. It's going to be really, really good. So apart from that, actually, let's go into the questions. That was fantastic, Phil. Really, really good. So I have a question, actually, before I go into this one. So, you know, when you were showing the hand, that was a beautiful picture. So Sofia as well here, a different Sofia, says, but are the hands and fingerprints biometric info too?
Yes, they are. I actually thought about this when I was putting that as an example.
Yeah.
I wondered if anyone would pick up on it, because essentially, I mean, I don't know enough about fingerprints to know if you could like pick up an image off that and actually like rip it. But the pictures on the site, I was like, wow, these are like really high definition pictures. You know, obviously as like cameras and stuff get better, so maybe you could like put a bit of a blur on that in Photoshop.
Yeah, but Sofia also mentioned that, and Sofia, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a follow-up, less than a question and more like a clarification. So she's saying also like, do you keep track of the data if it's anonymized? Like surely anonymizing that implies that you're severing that link before the data and the research participants. So yeah, anonymization is a thing. It's a very interesting topic because, for example, in our case, a lot of research teams and customers, want to keep their data anonymized. They want to be, doing things right and consent and so on. So we are processors. We basically process that data and we help people to manage that data. So it's a lot of responsibility on researchers to do it. So we can provide a lot of features for anonymization, and we do. But is that enough? I'm not sure. You need to use something like ConsentKit and your repository and really understand whether or not people need to be anonymized. And the reason why this is tricky is because if you are B2B, for example, and you can get customers to talk to you, that allows you to also create segmentation of that data. So if you have information about the people that you're talking to, your customers, it just allows you to have better analysis. You have more context, you have, what companies, how much they're paying, like any other demographic information, for example, for participants. So for B2B, anonymizing data feels almost like you are taking away this context that is so important. But at the same time, you have to do it. So I'm just telling you all that stuff and reading what Sofia said, because I have the same questions, like, is there severity just because you are doing things in B2B and B2C? Like, do you see that both is just the same, or like, what are the differences? Because that's another question. Does this apply to regular B2B context, even if you have all the data of those customers anyway?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what your lawful basis is for processing that data, right? Like if you have, so consent is like one of 6 lawful bases. This is specifically under GDPR, but I think CCPS has something similar. And it's like you basically like have a B2B, you'll have a contract between them. So it's like we can process data for this thing, but if it's an individual's data, you typically have consent to process that. So like the contract will probably cover like employees and things like that. But typically it's going to be, it will be, unless that person is like paying for a service, it would, and let's say they're taking part in research and just keep it on research, then it's going to be consent. It's probably going to be your like basis for processing that information. So and that basis is really like the blueprint for like what you can and can't do with that data, right? So if you've said in that, I'm going to anonymize your data, or we will like delete your data after like 90 days or whatever, you that's what you need to do. And that's kind of the agreement essentially. So I think about it like that. So you've made this person a promise, and that's how you should like uphold that promise. So the anonymization is really tricky, because once it's, so the GDPR only applies to PII, to personally identifiable information. And a lot of these privacy laws only apply to personally identifiable information, whether that's like direct or indirect. But that's what they apply to. So if you truly anonymize information, then in theory it's not PII anymore, which puts it outside the remit of things. Now I'm not a lawyer, so like don't quote me on that, but like that's kind of my understanding of it. So but then you for me this is against like the backdrop of why do we collect data as researchers, and like what is it that we're doing with this data? And it's like we're really using it to learn things and to tell stories. And one of the things I'm really curious about is this idea of like, can you tell stories with like, I call it like zombie data, you know, it's like you've got this like, imagine having like your story and I could tell you something really personal about me and I could strip out all of the PII out of that. So you would hear this like muffled voice that would sound like this, and it would maybe be like a blurry face, and it would be, you know, there would be like boop, boop every now and again when I'd like say certain things or whatever. And like, do you think like when you watch that, like it would be so weird to see, you know, you'd be like, well, is this actually like any that human impact, you know, that you get from really powerful like stories? Like, is that still going to be there, or does that just go, you know, as soon as you take it out? And it's kind of so it's like, what's the usefulness of it, I suppose? Like, and like how, I don't know how that kind of works, and I don't know, like I don't have an answer to that yet. I'd like to kind of experiment with that a little bit more, but I think that the more you strip out of it, the less useful it becomes. So I think what some people do is they'll like anonymize everything, but what the easier thing to do is just to delete stuff, I guess. But then it's really about like, well, for me, it's like if I wanted to use that for something else, it's like, what if another way is to actually, I can go back to the person and just ask them again and just say, hey, you spoke to us 6 months ago and about this thing, and like what, I don't know what type of beans you wanted to buy or something, and we wanted to, you know, use that information for another thing. Like, do you mind if we use it again? And then, you know, see what they say, you know. And I think a lot of the time it's not always the case, but like sometimes when you can recruit around like a social value rather than like an incentive, or say, you know, we want to try and make this thing better, or maybe they believe in it because they're like part of the community or whatever, and the value for them is improving that thing or improving like aspects of the community, then a lot of the time, you know, to kind of continue to help, it's like it's something that becomes, you know, it's quite a good thing for them to do. And that's how I kind of see this privacy like landscape shifting and changing, and it's something that we're trying to, you know, we are enabling with ConsentKit is like, okay, to actually practically do that's quite difficult. So it's like, how can we continue to the value of research without losing that? But you know, it really becomes about managing data around relationships.
Absolutely. Wow, we have a lot of questions. Ooh. So we have here, Barbara is saying, for B2B user research, when I'm getting consent to gather data from an employee, does that data belong to the employee or the employee's organization?
I think it belongs to the employee, I would say. This is also really difficult because if you're in the same organization, and like I hear a lot of the times people say, like, to me, and I kind of agree with it, is that you can never really get informed, like true consent from someone in a company, because it's like, if you think about like coercion, you know, it's like one of the things is like consent is like freely given, right? It's like fundamental to informed consent. So if consent isn't freely given, then it's not really like valid. And if your boss is saying to you, you need to take part in this study, and you know, at what grounds do you have to say, actually, no, I don't want to? You know, what's the culture like in that organization? You know, and like how, do you know what I mean? So it's like, that's kind of, it gets kind of difficult. In theory, like that should totally belong to the individual and not to the organization, but the organization would be the controller for that information.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's so tricky. It's just human. At the end of the day, it's data, but it's really human relationships. Right, and then what I consider is okay, and what the company thinks is not okay, and the legal frameworks around that is just tricky. Christina is asking here, how much indirect identifiers is too much? Should we get rid of that from research reports post end of the data retention process, for example, if the age of the participant is relevant in the research?
Sorry, can you ask that again?
Can you go to the question, because I read that horribly. So you can just see the question mark in the live chat. Maybe you can see that it's Christina. So it's...
Oh yeah, got it. It depends. It's just about it's about identification. You know, like I mean, some indirect identifiers might you could put them together. I guess it's like when you look at this and you think, okay, of all the information that we have, is that enough to identify this person? So that thing called that I talked about called the motivated intruder test is really interesting. And it's like, okay, what data sets either do we have now or are we likely to have in the future, which could we use to identify this person? And that's really like how I guess you'd figure out how much is too much and like where that kind of balance is. But yeah, it's not simple.
Yeah, Anna is asking, this is a very good question. She's asking, what do you think will be the ideal approach to gathering informed consent as an alternative to send unknowingly, PDF to print and so on?
Well, consent kit obviously would be the best thing.
Yes. I was taking from your company asking that question, and then it's not. It's a genuinely question here. Yes, you made it so easy. And then when we decided to integrate with Consent Kit, it was mostly because the workflow is so simple, so easy, it's very straightforward, and it just would allow our customers to feel better about their practice and their research practice. So I think this is a wonderful workflow, and I can't wait to launch the integration. But yeah, like whether or not we have an integration just yet, you should totally check it out, because I find that very annoying. I think it just feels so very old that people send you PDF to print and so on, especially at this time, in terms of pandemic and so on that you were saying before. It's really like unfair to expect like somebody is going to take their time and do all the hassle just to give you time to also do research with you. Like, I'm already participating on this. I'm already trying to help you by doing this interview, but on top of that, I need to print a bunch of documents. So I think like it's kind of almost disrespectful.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it drives me crazy when people do it, and like, yeah, not even just in consent, but in any kind of like contract or anything. It's like, what is this? It's like 2020.
Yeah, right. So yeah, so you can totally use Consent Kit for that. Let's see, we have any other questions?
I think just to give you like an alternative that isn't a total plug for the product as well. Like, really, like the best way to do it is to have a conversation like with the person. Is like the ultimate way to do it, and to just really make sure that they understand and and just do that. The problem with that is when so a lot of people might capture that verbally. The problem with verbal consent is that all of the stuff that comes after the fact, like, it's very difficult to like document verbal consent and say this is like proof of it. So it's often like less efficient or whatever to do it that way. Like, you need to be able to search and find that thing, pull it out and say this is the proof that we have, and you need to be able to see like, well, what were the permissions that they gave us. So it's like what things did they agree to, and so you have to listen to the recording in order to do that. So there's a bunch of other problems around it. From the end person's perspective, like, you can't really beat just a conversation with that person, and that's kind of where we're trying to go with Consent Kit and get to that level of of consent, really.
Absolutely. I don't know, guys, if you're looking at the chat, but they were talking about Spotify having really great ways of telling stories with anonymized data. So they put some examples there, and maybe you want to check out those links. It looks really good. We have Sam. Let me see, Sam. Yeah, so Sam says, I see product development differentiator opportunity for EnjoyHQ, especially for enterprise customers. We'll anonymize our data as it comes into the repository. Yes, indeed. It's all about making the workflow very easy. So all researchers, designers, product managers, you can just focus on learning and design and just analyzing the data and getting the story out, right? And being able to use those insights for decision making. So everything else that gets in the way should be automated. And that's the whole point. We are just about to end here the session. I really appreciate everybody to show up. You are going to get the recording. You're going to get the presentation. Please sign up for next webinars. They're coming very soon. We always have something cooking in the background. If you don't know anything about EnjoyHQ, please go to our site. Exactly the link that you're going to receive in the email. And then if you want a demo, I can do a demo for you. If you want to have a demo with Consent Kit, you can get in touch with Phil. Just go to ConsentKit.io. ConsentKit.io, and you can go to Twitter as well to ConsentKit. ConsentKit. My goodness, the accent sometimes gets in the way. Like, oh. So yeah, what else we have? Yeah, let me see the question. No.
Sorry, just one thing on that as well is like at the moment, you know, it's, I don't know if anyone else is feeling this, but like it's really difficult to just like focus and concentrate and like, you know, do things. And it's like one of the things when you were saying about automating the workflow, which I think is really important, is like how can we get to a place where it's like we find the right people and we invest the time in finding the right people to learn from. And then in between like finding the right people and then turning up to the session, like how can we just remove as much of the headspace, you know, how can we free up as much headspace as possible and take care of all the research admin, the back and forth, going in and out of emails, checking if someone's signed, if they've given permission, all of these like jobs that we have to do that start to add up and add up and add up. Like how do we get to a place where like all of that stuff is kind of taken care of, and then you can spend the time focusing on that session, and you can use the time that you get back to focus on synthesis and get better research outcomes. Yeah, and that's really like the crux of what we're trying to do.
Excellent. Oh, thank you very much for all the amazing comments and the questions. Thank you again for participating in this webinar, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you so much, Phil. It was amazing. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Sofia.
Bye. Take care, guys.